Now we're going to look at Section 3, looking at the post-war period after the Spanish-American War, and how the U.S. began to deal with Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other Latin American interests. So our learning objectives are to compare how the United States restored order in Cuba and Puerto Rico after the Spanish-American War, and to describe U.S. involvement in Latin America in the early 20th century. In order to restore order in Cuba and Puerto Rico after the war, President McKinley set up military governments. To keep other nations from taking over Cuba, the U.S. forced them to add the Platt Amendment to their constitution. The amendment made Cuba a U.S. protectorate, or a country under the control and protection of another country. The amendment also gave the U.S. rights to establish naval bases in Cuba, which is how the U.S. acquired the base at Guantanamo Bay, which we still have today, commonly referred to as Gitmo. The Foraker Act allowed the U.S. to appoint the upper house of Puerto Rico's legislature and its governor. And in 1952, Puerto Rico became a self-governing commonwealth. Now, Puerto Rico is still, to this day, a U.S. territory, but Puerto Rico is, once again, a self-governing commonwealth. There has been some talk of statehood, but it seems that opinion's fairly divided, even in Puerto Rico, about the possibility of them becoming a state. Now we're going to look at the building of the Panama Canal. The French were the first to attempt to cut a canal across Panama. The U.S. purchased the project from the French. Colombia, which ruled Panama, would not grant the U.S. the rights to build the canal. The U.S. supported Panamanian rebels in their quest for independence from Colombia, and immediately after, Panama gave the U.S. the 10-mile-wide canal zone. Work on the canal began in 1904. Building the canal posed great technical problems. In addition, malaria was a major problem that slowed construction. Sanitation workers had to drain swamps and clear vegetation to get rid of the mosquitoes that caused malaria. Finally, the canal opened in 1914. And of course, this is a very complex project because the canal actually goes over a mountain range, which meant that to adjust for the different water levels, they actually had to build a system of locks so that ships can be raised and lowered as they move into the next lock. The whole thing is very complex, but it ends up being a huge success, dramatically cutting shipping times from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States, as now ships could go through the Panama Canal rather than having to go all the way around the tip of South America. And now we look at Roosevelt's big stick policy. The Monroe Doctrine said that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to European powers. European countries and the United States had made large loans to Latin America. Latin American countries had a hard time repaying those loans. So Theodore Roosevelt issued the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine was a policy statement issued by President Monroe many, many years before, in the 1800s, where he basically said that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to any further European colonies. The Roosevelt Corollary, in effect, says that if European countries aren't going to be allowed to have involvement in the Western Hemisphere, that the United States would be involved in Latin American affairs. Then, under President William Howard Taft, we saw a new policy. Taft believed in dollar diplomacy, meaning that we relied on economic pressure rather than military force. Taft suggested that the U.S. buy out European loans to Latin America. Some Latin American countries disliked this policy. After American banks made loans to Nicaragua, the U.S. leaders had to send in troops to stop a revolt. Then we moved into the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. As president, Woodrow Wilson believed in moral diplomacy, or supporting countries that are democratic and withholding support from non-democratic countries. This played a role in his policies relating to the Mexican Revolution.